Good morning. Great to be with you on this Wednesday morning. We're halfway through the week, and there is a lot of news today. Do unfortunately have to start off on a very somber note because, of course, the nation is in a national day of mourning. Bush Sr., as we discussed earlier this week when we discussed it on Monday morning, has passed away. His funeral will be today at the National Cathedral. I've personally been to the National Cathedral, and it is a beautiful facility. It's something that is really awe-inspiring, and if you ever do go to D.C., it's not actually owned by the government, so it's kind of out of the way of what most people consider where D.C. is. I mean, it's still in the city, but it's kind of off by itself. You'll have to take a cab or something there, but I highly recommend going to see that, and it is certainly worth the trip. So I think that our former president made a wise decision in deciding that his dad should be buried and should have his funeral session at the National Cathedral. And I think that that's only appropriate considering he was our former president. And of course, he will be having his funeral there today, but his body will eventually be laid to rest at the Bush Library, the Presidential Library, which I believe is in Houston, Texas. I know it's in Texas, but I don't remember if it's actually in Houston. I think it is, though. So because of that, the nation is appropriately in mourning today. I've heard that the post office isn't even going to run today. There are some schools that have decided to go ahead and take the day off. And I understand that to a degree. I do think that it is worthy of honor, even though Bush Sr. was not somebody that I agreed with very often. I mean, God forbid this would happen, but if we lost Jimmy Carter or we lost Barack Obama, I would be saying the same thing, even though I didn't agree with their politics very often. So, Bush Sr., I think this move is something that is appropriate, and of course our prayers go out to the Bush family. I know that this cannot be an easy time for them, having now lost their patriarch, and somebody that was just such an amazing influence to them, somebody that, again, whether you agreed with his politics or not, was a great family man. And I do think there's an important opportunity for Americans to think about right now, because George H.W. Bush was somebody that actually fought in World War II. And I'm not trying to downplay any of the hardships and the real sacrifices that happen every single day with our brave men and women that are fighting overseas right now, or that happened in subsequent wars, Vietnam, Korea, whatever else you want to talk about, Desert Storm, Grenada, so on and so forth. But World War II, let's remember how astonishing it is that we came out on top in that conflict. Going over to Europe to fight an ocean away, the technology was nowhere near what it is today. Battlefield survivability was very low. I mean, if you got shot, because the medicine wasn't all that advanced back then compared to what we have now, there were a lot of people that would be alive today if they had the medical treatment and the medical know-how in World War II that they do now. Our battlefield survivability is much higher now than it used to be. The survivability, if you actually are wounded, is much, much higher. And this is one thing that I think that the younger generation can really learn from. And I say this as somebody who has heard old war stories at the feet of a Bronze Star recipient in the form of my great-grandfather, who is still alive to this day, and the man that probably I admire most out of anybody that I know. This is part of the problem that I think a lot of people in the older generation and the younger generation, there's always a generational divide. There's always been that generational divide. And I'm not saying that there have never been issues between old people and young people, because that is as true as time itself. That has always been the case. But one thing that I think a lot of the older generation is just kind of looking at the people that are around my age or younger and sort of shaking their heads is because you have to keep in mind that that generation, the greatest generation, the generation of our great-grandparents, when they were 20 years old, they weren't working a part-time job at Starbucks and going to college and complaining about having to figure out how to make their rent, which I get is a legitimate problem. It's a problem that I had when I was in college. But I mean, you compare that and millennials complaining about, just every little thing being the end of the world and talking about how horrible their lives are and how horrible America is and how it's a racist country and it's really not better than any other country. Keep in mind that the reason we have this country is because men like George H.W. Bush went and fought to preserve it. think about how many dystopian fictions took place because the Nazis actually won World War II. You've got Amazon series The Man in the High Castle. You can look at, there was a event not too long ago, I think it was about a year ago on the CW, where Arrow and The Flash and Supergirl and all those shows got together. They're living in a dystopian parallel universe where the Nazis won. I mean, pretty much everybody agrees that had that happened, we would be looking at a very different, much darker world. And there were men like George H.W. Bush and my great-grandfather and others that when they were 20 years old, they were being shot at by Nazis. So that's why they're a little unsympathetic to people that are in their 20s right now working on a degree that they know is probably not going to be very useful to them later, and doing so on somebody else's dime and complaining that tuition's too high. It's a little hard for them to swallow complaining about that when you consider that when they were your age, they were fighting literal Nazis, storming beaches, being shot at, paratrooping down into different regions in Europe, facing off against tanks, or island hopping over in the Pacific. And it was because of those sacrifices and because of that that we were able to enjoy the freedom that we have now. And I think understanding that does put it into perspective. And that's one thing that I do hope that we can gain in taking a look back at the Greatest Generation now that the passing of George H.W. Bush has happened. Maybe this is a moment where our nation can take a look back at the Greatest Generation and remember why they are called that. That being said, I do think that we tend to complain about problems as a whole, not just my generation, but we tend to complain about issues and tend to blow them up larger than they actually are. And I think that part of that, and I say this, remember, being a part of the media myself, is that sometimes we in the media tend to jump to a knee-jerk reaction far too quickly, and we tend to blow things out of proportion. Because sometimes stepping back and taking a little perspective, like I'm suggesting we do with the Greatest Generation, and look at our lives in comparison to the lives of those who have had difficulties in the past, I think adding that little perspective really helps not necessarily downplay or mitigate our problems, but it helps us have an appreciation for where we are and the abilities that we have, and maybe let us know that our problems that we're dealing with, first of all, aren't new, which means that they do have solutions. But second of all, maybe they're not nearly as bad as we think of them. We like to play the victim, and we like to do this woe is me routine from time to time, which is not healthy. But this is the difference in a victim and a conqueror. And I think that people would be more likely to see themselves as conquerors if they believe the obstacles that they were facing are, first of all, not new, and second of all, can be surmounted, can be surpassed. And so because of that, I think adding that little perspective gives us a real insight into the seriousness of the problem. And if it's not nearly as serious as we thought it is, suddenly the problem doesn't seem all that daunting and maybe encourages us to work a little harder on it because it is something that can be solved. And one of the things that I wanted to bring up sort of in relation to this idea is that there's a new study out by the the Crime Prevention Research Center. So that's a group headed by John Lott. He's a professor, or I think he's still a professor. He may have resigned to just do this full time, but he was a professor of criminology at the University of Chicago. He dealt specifically with crime, and so that's the foundation that he put together. And this new study finds that the U.S. is 64th in mass shootings per capita compared to other nations. And there's a couple of reasons why this is important, because first of all, the left tends to paint mass shootings and gun crime as a uniquely American problem. We hear this all the time, where when there are people advocating for gun control, they talk about mass shootings. I mean, you could do a montage, look it up on YouTube. You can hear media pundits talk about how this is an epidemic. This is only happening in America. We're the only country with this problem. I can't tell you the number of times I've heard Bernie Sanders say that, other people on the left like Elizabeth Warren, Dianne Feinstein. When they talk about this problem, they always try to paint it as, well, this is a problem that is only happening in America. America is the only nation that has issues with people using guns to hurt other people. Only the problem with that theory is if you look at the actual data, it doesn't back up that worldview. In fact, it kind of tells us the exact opposite. I'm really glad they put this study together because the truth is there's very little good data on this. Because mass shootings are such rare events, not just in America, but worldwide. Mass shootings just don't happen that often, which is part of the reason that they make news, is because if it were happening all the time, it would be mundane and it wouldn't be newsworthy. And so the fact that mass shootings are by their very nature rare is part of the reason that they get so much media attention. But because they get a lot of media attention, people tend to think that they are far more prevalent than they actually are. It's like a few years ago, you remember that we had stories of shark attack after shark attack. But then when you looked at the data, it turns out actually shark attacks were a little bit down that year. Not by much, but the point is it was a little below average that year. The reason that there was a perception that all these shark attacks were happening is because the public developed a fascination with it, and because of that, the media, every time there was a shark attack story, they rolled with it. And so because of that, there was this perception that there was this epidemic, this big problem that had just started. And this is why looking at history can really help us in dealing with our problems, because it gives us this kind of perspective. And in this particular case, because they say, well, it's a uniquely American problem. Only America has this problem with guns. Only America has this level of gun homicide. Only America has this problem of mass shootings. We're the only civilized country in the world that has this. Well, it turns out when you look at the data, that's not even close to true. So when you are looking at the data, you'll notice that when you get into these arguments, it's fairly consistent that they almost always use stats that ignore population or nations that have higher numbers. For example, you remember, I don't know, it was about 2 years ago, I did an analysis of a video that was put together by Vox.com. So Vox put out this internet video, and what they were doing is they were basically making the case that America has a gun problem. But the problem is, when you looked at their sources, the ones that they cited in their own video, you'll notice that they left out several significant countries in their graphics. So they had a graphic that it was a bar graph, and it had America compared to other countries when it came to gun deaths, which we'll get to in a second. And you'll notice that it far surpassed every other country. But if you look at their own sources, it turns out they left off countries like Russia and Mexico that had higher numbers than America. So they specifically only included the countries that were less than America to help make America look bad. Because again, they had an agenda. They didn't care what the data said. They had a conclusion that they had already reached, and they were just trying to find data points to try to confirm what they already believed instead of doing research and then forming a conclusion based on where the evidence led them. So what they did in that one was, and this is a common tactic when you're talking gun control, is that they'll leave out the countries that have a bigger problem with it, or, and sometimes in conjunction with, they'll also refer to it as gun deaths. And the reason that anytime you see gun deaths, you should be automatically suspicious is because they're probably including suicides in that. So, in other words, they're not only including people that actually shoot other people, they're counting people that shoot themselves and end their lives that way. And when you're looking at gun deaths, they're also much higher in states that have more guns per capita. Which makes sense, because if you were going to kill yourself, a gun is a fairly painless way to do it. I mean, if you shoot yourself correctly, it's going to be virtually instantaneous. But the problem with that is that if you're looking at other countries that have very severe gun restrictions and very few privately owned guns, like Japan has an astronomically large suicide rate, much, much more prevalent per capita than America's. And yet, when you're... Oh, sorry, I just got a notification on my computer there that was distracting me. Anyway, so when you're looking at this and comparing by countries, there are some countries like Japan that have a really big problem with suicides despite not really having a whole lot of guns. And so once you just limit it to gun homicides, you'll notice that there are several countries with much stricter gun control that have more gun homicides and homicides in general than America does. And this is one of the things that this survey, this study, points out. And you'll never see that when the left tries to push their gun agenda, because they know it breaks their argument. And they will usually bolster these stats by including suicides. but actually there are several nations with higher per capita homicides and gun homicides total. Like we talked about, Mexico and Russia, both two countries that have incredibly restrictive gun control measures, and yet have higher homicides and gun homicides than the United States. So here's what they usually do. When those stats fail them and they know that they're losing the argument, they love to point to mass shootings, because mass shootings are a big, very emotional, very traumatic public event. And they'll always demand that we make gun legislation in the heat of the moment, when our emotions are high, when judgment is clouded, which is the worst possible time for people to be making any kind of decision. Not just on this, when your emotions are high, you are likely to do something stupid, because you're acting on emotion, not reason, not rationale. And they know that that is their best chance to get gun control legislation passed, and because of that, they will usually hype it and try to make it a big deal and try to get it pushed through immediately so people don't stop and think, is this actually a good idea or not? Because the second you start thinking and using logic, you realize that their proposals do not stand up to scrutiny. So the Crime Prevention Research Center released a study comparing these other nations when it comes to mass shootings, and then adjusted for the population. And this is a really important distinction, because if we're comparing countries, we also have to adjust for population. It's not fair to compare, for example, America to the UK when it comes to mass shootings strictly on numbers, because just by sheer numeric values, America would obviously have more than a lot of the European nations, just because we have more people. And so it's a really important distinction to remember, that whenever you're looking at this, you really need to look at a study that adjusts for population, and this one does. So it turns out when you do that, apparently the U.S. is actually far below average on mass shooting rates. There were 0.13 per 100,000 people, which again emphasizes that in most countries, not just America, in most countries, mass shootings are a very, very rare event. They just don't happen all that often. But America, even if you're looking at it as a rare event, still has significantly less than average. So the U.S. has about 4.6% of the world population. And that makes sense, because if you've got about 7.5 billion, then 325 million that are living in the U.S. would be about 4.6% of the world's population. And yet, despite having about 4.5% of the world's population, we make up less than 1.15% of mass public shooters, and 1.49% of their murders, and 2.2% of their attacks. So if you're looking at it, you're looking at the number of people that we have, and compare that with how often we have attacks, and how often our people are killed by those attacks. It's significantly less than it should be when you're adjusting for population. So compared to other nations, the U.S. ranks about 64th out of 97 countries that they found incidents with mass shootings in the past time frame. Because keep in mind, this study goes from 1998 to 2015, so it's not going way back. It's using recent history. It's using the past. It's using a range of 17 years there. So it's using recent history and recent statistics to back this up. So we're 64th out of 97 in mass shootings, and 65th in mass shooting deaths. So they don't just compare the incidents where a mass shooting took place, they are also measuring how often people died from those mass shootings. And it turns out that America is significantly lower in deaths even than they are in incidents. Like I said with the statistics that I was just pointing out, when you're looking at how often they happen, it's less than half of our population if you're adjusting. So if we're 4.6% of the world's population and we only account for 2.2% of the mass shootings, but then you look at the murders and it's only 1.5%, that means our mass shootings are also less deadly in America than they are in other countries. So 64th overall, 65th in mass shooting deaths. This completely debunks the arguments that having more guns and deadlier guns here in America is what leads to more mass shootings, because America has way more guns than every other country. It's not even close. I mean, second place isn't even in the ballpark with us. And yet, despite this, having all these guns, and we do have a lot of them, doesn't lead to more mass shootings. We're actually, like I said, below average. And despite having quote unquote deadlier guns, in other words, a lot of countries that have guns available to the public, they severely limit the capabilities of those firearms. So, for example, they would have what we would refer to here in America as assault rifle bans. And I know assault rifle is basically a made up term. But when you're talking about an assault rifle or assault weapons, those weapons are severely, severely limited in other countries. And despite this, it seems that our mass shootings are not any more deadly than their mass shootings. In fact, we're less likely to have deaths because of our mass shootings than other countries that have the same amount of shootings. And so when you're comparing it that way, it becomes very, very clear that this argument that the left constantly makes, that we have these super deadly guns that can make anybody an expert and can go in and just kill all these people, and also we have so many guns, well, apparently neither one of those correlate to actual having a higher amount of mass shootings or mass shooting deaths. Now, granted, and I do think that it is fair to bring this up, there are some nations that are on the list ahead of us that are not necessarily fair comparisons, and John Law admits that right here. Some of them, not all of them, because some of the countries that you're looking at are countries that are war-torn, they're incredibly impoverished, and so when you're looking at third world nations, that's not really a fair comparison, and he understands that. He says, this is the raw data, and then he gives some commentary on it. But nonetheless, there are several notable nations that we would consider more prominent nations with higher mass shooting rates. For example, Israel, which to a degree is understandable. They are in the Middle East. That's a dangerous part of the world. But then you get into Finland, Switzerland, France, India, Georgia, Russia, Croatia, Yugoslavia. So a lot of European nations, a lot of what we would consider the first world. Those nations also have higher rates of mass shootings and deaths by those mass shootings. On average, when you're looking at the European nations, about 25% higher mass shooting rates than us. So when you're looking at, for example, France and Russia, they have 25% more mass shootings despite having far more restrictive gun control laws. Far more restrictive. I mean, you look at especially Russia and France. Much, much more stringent gun laws than we have. More stringent even than Barack Obama and a lot of people on the left have called for. And yet, despite having even more than the left is asking us to put into place, they still have more mass shootings than we do. And you're looking at the U.S. share of attacks are actually trending down as our gun ownership is rising. And so to prove my point, this is actually taken from the study. Take a look at this chart. So this is the frequency at which mass shootings are taking place, and you can see that the blue line is every other country in the world, and then the orange line is the United States. Well, mass shootings are actually on the rise, and then they started a downward trend. It looks like in 2016 they started decreasing a little bit, which is great, which is good. Of course, we don't want that to take place. But if you're looking at the U.S. shootings, overall it's a downward trend. And when you're looking at the trend line for mass shootings over the past 17 years, with Europe, it's gone up exponentially. With the U.S., it's gone up a little, but not much. And recently it's been on a downward trend since about 2012 where it peaked. So when you're looking at these and you really understand what's going on, because the stats are the stats, the numbers are the numbers, they are what they are. It's very clear to see that this idea that more guns equals more crime, or more guns equals more mass shootings, or more deaths by mass shootings, mathematically it's simply not the case. The stats do not bear that out. In fact, if you look at this other graph that we have, again from the same study, this is the United States, which you can look way over there on the right. If you're looking way over there on the right, that's us. And the vertical axis there is the number of people killed per 100,000 people in mass shootings. And then the x-axis there, the one that you're looking at, the horizontal axis, is the number of guns per 100 people. So you can see there are a lot of nations that have way more gun deaths, way more deaths by mass shooting than we do. But when you're looking at the United States, we've got way more guns than everybody else. It's not even close. In fact, the next closest nations there, it seems as though the nations that actually have more guns tend to be on the lower end of the spectrum when it comes to people killed per 100,000. And they did note in there that they removed a handful of really extreme cases where there's war or extreme poverty. And so when you're looking at this graph, it does show, interestingly enough, that apparently the more guns you have, actually you tend to be in the lower end of the spectrum when it comes to death by mass shootings. So when you understand that, this narrative that having more guns in your population necessarily results in more mass shootings and more deaths by those mass shootings, the numbers simply do not bear that out. So despite what you're going to hear in the media, mass shootings overall are actually getting a lot less frequent, and they're getting less deadly, both in America and overall. Now, there was a trending upward, there's a trend upward, but you've seen in recent years, if you're looking at that graph again, both overall in the world and in America, it's gone down. This year has been a particularly bad year. We have had more this year than we've had in a while, but it's still nowhere near what it is for the rest of the world, even if you're counting this year. And actually, you've probably seen quite a few in Europe as well. So we'll have to wait for the data on that to look at this year, because of course this year isn't over yet. But the point is, if you're looking at it overall, this idea that guns equal more gun deaths and more mass shooting, I'm sorry, it just doesn't bear that out. The numbers simply do not bear that out. And so this is really the problem that I have with gun control as a whole. Because this is what they're proposing. They're proposing if we just got some common sense gun control, then all of our problems would go away. Not if you're looking at what happened with the rest of the world, because like I said, there's several nations that are higher than us on this list, like Switzerland and France and Russia. And if you're looking at it from that perspective, then what would happen if we were to go along with what the left is proposing is that we would have less freedom, less ability to own firearms and defend ourselves, and we would essentially get nothing out of it. In fact, like that graph showed, it seems to be a trend that the countries that have more guns owned by private citizens, actually they tend to be on the lower end of the spectrum when it comes to mass shootings. So what we would eventually wind up with is less freedom and absolutely nothing to show for giving up our liberties. And that's why I oppose gun control. Michael Avenatti, who you may remember, he is the attorney for Stormy Daniels, the porn star that is alleging that she had an affair with Donald Trump and has gone around talking about this for, I guess, a little over a year now. So Michael Avenatti has been toying with the idea of a 2020 presidential run. Now, always take this with a grain of salt. Because, first of all, this is kind of run-of-the-mill in politics that people tell you they're not running and then it turns out actually they are running. And second of all, the guy's a lawyer, so, I mean, you can't really take anything he's saying to be the absolute truth anyway. And that has been true of Avenatti on a number of issues, not just this. But Avenatti has announced that he is not going to run in the 2020 presidential election, which I have to say, I'm genuinely disappointed if he doesn't run. And I'm not blowing smoke up somebody's butt. I'm not being sarcastic at all. I genuinely would hate to see him not be in the Democrat primary and possibly even the candidate when it comes to because look, I don't like the guy at all. I think he's a pretty garbage human being, honestly, but you got to admit the guy's entertaining. And I think part of the reason that a lot of people on the left really like him is because in a lot of ways he has the same quality that Trump does. He's sort of like Trump on the left. And by that I mean not real smart when it comes to policy, not real bright on that, not very well educated on those things, but he is a fighter and he likes to punch things, just like Trump likes to punch things. And he admits as much. He has said this before. In fact, in the statement that he released announcing that he wouldn't run, he said, for the Democrats to win, they're going to need a fighter. And right now we don't have one. And so I guess he's looking at Booker and Kamala Harris and Elizabeth Warren and all these other guys and saying, I don't see anybody. He said this in a statement on Twitter. I don't see anybody that could actually beat Trump in 2020, which I believe was sort of a backhanded way of leaving just a little bit of room open for him to say, okay, I thought there was going to be a good candidate that was a fighter. Obviously there's not. So I'm throwing my hat in the ring, and I'm hoping that he does. Because again, the guy is a absolute dumpster fire. But it is fun to watch. It's like watching a wreck when you go past it. You just can't not look. And because Avenatti is the guy that goes in there and mixes it up and goes on guys like Tucker Carlson's show, that kind of thing, and goes on and confronts them, and he loves the fight. He loves being in the middle of the fire. There are a lot of Democrats that really like that. Now, again, just like the Republicans that really like that aspect of Trump's personality, I don't really understand it myself because that doesn't appeal to me. But there were people on the right that really hated that the left was always constantly dogging us, talking about us as though there was something wrong with being conservative, having a heritage, loving America, being proud of your country. There were people, not all on the left, but there was a considerable amount of people on the left that were saying, if you don't think a 35-year-old man shouldn't be allowed to go to the bathroom next to a 6-year-old girl in a girl's room, then there's something wrong with you. You're the bad person. You're the bigot. You're the immoral one. And people got tired of that after a while. And justifiably so. We got tired of people assuming that there was ill intent just for saying, no, that's going to cause a myriad of other problems. The same thing with the gay marriage thing, saying that's going to cause some issues, both from a societal standpoint and from a government standpoint, from a freedom of religion standpoint, if you start declaring something a right. And by the way, history has bore out that the conservatives were absolutely right on that. We were correct in that prediction. And yet, every time we bring up an opposition to it, even if you're not necessarily saying you want to persecute homosexuals or anything like that, even if you believe they're wrong, they say, you're the bigot, you're the intolerant person, you need to get in the back and shut up. Get back in line. People got tired of that, and so Trump comes along and says, you know what, these people are idiots, and nobody cares about them, and everybody knows that you're being disingenuous. I like that aspect of Trump's personality. And other people liked it so much that they kind of ignored the fact that he wasn't real well-versed in a lot of the other issues. And I think that a similar thing is happening on the left. I'm seeing articles left and right, whether it comes to Vox or the Huffington Post or MSNBC, people that are actually coming out and saying the left doesn't go far enough. We need to go full-on democratic socialism. We need to go all the way to the left. In fact, a lot of people are even saying this about Obama. Obama didn't go far left enough. We need to be more radical. We need to be more in people's faces. We need to be more restrictive when it comes to things like free speech and freedom of religion. And we need to get rid of capitalism altogether. This is a growing trend in the Democrat Party. And because of that, and because Michael Avenatti is the guy that goes and punches, even though he's not maybe necessarily what you would call a dyed-in-the-wool socialist, in the same way that Donald Trump is not a dyed-in-the-wool conservative, then people do respond well to Michael Avenatti because he has that sort of fighter instinct. And so we may be seeing a very similar thing play out on the left. Now, I don't know if that means that Michael Avenatti does run or doesn't run, or he actually does wind up at the nomination. I don't know. I'm not predicting that. But I'm saying we're seeing a similar phenomenon, a similar reaction by people on the left to a lot of the people on the right's reaction to Donald Trump, which eventually propelled him to sort of eke out a narrow victory against the other candidates when it came to the GOP primary. So it's an interesting idea. I don't know that Michael Avenatti is going to keep to his word and actually stay out of the race. I think that he may still toy with it, but I genuinely hope he does, because you can't tell me a debate between Avenatti and other Democrats or Avenatti and Donald Trump would not be thoroughly entertaining. That's great primetime TV. I don't care who you are. So we'll see if that actually bears out. I don't know if it will or not. But speaking of cracking down on freedom of speech, which I mentioned just a second ago, it is happening again. And unfortunately, it seems that we cannot go but, just a few weeks at a time without some form of social media cracking down. I mean, here recently, it's been every single week we've had at least one story about that, about social media or a big tech company cracking down on free speech. Last week it was Twitter and Google. This time it's Facebook. And this is not a story that I'm drawing from anywhere. I didn't pick this up, at one of my usual sources. I didn't get it as a notification on Twitter, anything like that. This story happened to me. And I'm not even talking about because they did censor me, but more importantly, it was what I was posting, because in the past, when they've censored me, they've done it because I have shared something that usually I made up that they deemed as offensive or something. For example, one of my podcasts, I think they wound up taking down because I talked about how homosexuality was a sin. Then somebody flagged it and they wound up taking it down. Later, actually every single time up until now that I have talked about something that got censored on Facebook, it had to do with homosexuality. But anyway, the most recent development is that Facebook is censoring me when I share things from the Daily Wire. And apparently it is not just happening to me. I've heard different reports with this. So Facebook, I guess, is just going to war with Ben Shapiro now, because the two posts that I put up that got censored and they said that it violated the community standards, it was just articles from the Daily Wire. That's all it was. I think there was only one that I actually commented on. I added my own personal comment, and all I was saying is that Alexandria Ocasio-Cortez, who the article was about, is not correct very often. I said that my left boot is right more often than her, which is, a play on words because I love puns. But anyway, the Daily Wire, it's important to understand in context why that's significant, because there are a lot of people on the left that are actually upset with Facebook for allowing the Daily Wire to be as popular as it is. And it is popular. In fact, I remember a day that the left was fussing about it in particular, that the Daily Wire had, I think, 4 or 5 of the top 10 trending stories on Facebook. Do you have any idea how significant that is? They had the top 4, they had about 4 or 5 out of the top 10. That's huge. Getting one in the top 10. If you get one story and you happen to be 10th trending on Facebook all that day, that is a huge deal. I would love to have that. Ben Shapiro had 4 or 5 of them all at the same time. So the Daily Wire, when it comes to social media, punches way above its weight. I mean, without spending a ton of money, they have a staff on there, but they're not a huge staff. They're not a massive organization. They're not a multimedia conglomerate like News Corp with Fox News or NBC Universal with MSNBC and NBC. I mean, you could go on and on, Turner Broadcasting with CNN. They're not this huge media conglomerate. They're basically just run and financed by Ben Shapiro and the money that his podcast and some of the other podcasts, Andrew Klavan, Michael Knowles, that they're able to bring in. So despite the fact that they don't have a ton of money compared to those other guys, they still wind up with a lot of the top trending stories on Facebook. And this is something that is a point of contention with a lot of people on the left that have actually suggested that they kick Ben Shapiro off because he is so popular on Facebook. Well, it looks like they're at least toying with the idea, because I have had reports of 4 different people having Daily Wire article links pulled. 4 different ones, and that's just in my little personal friend group. There's also another person that reported they had another one of their posts censored last night that was from the Daily Post. Now, I don't know much about the Daily Post. I don't know if they have a political lend one way or the other or not, but I know what the Daily Wire is for. And it's just amazing to me that a group like Ben Shapiro's group at the Daily Wire that is so popular is being censored, and apparently they are being censored because they have a very distinct conservative worldview. So let's go ahead and look at this story. These are the stories that I had censored the other night. I had multiple notifications warning me that these posts had been deemed unfit. So you can actually see it right there at the top. This post goes against our community standards. The first one that you're seeing over there on your left is about Alexandria Ocasio-Cortez. It was actually the topic of our Daily Dose of Stupid yesterday. So you may remember we were talking about it. It's not as though it was just the Daily Wire that was saying that she was wrong, though, because you may remember that both the Washington Post and PolitiFact both said that she was completely wrong. Washington Post fact checker giving her 4 Pinocchios, and PolitiFact fact checker giving her a false rating. So it's not like it was just the opinion of the Daily Wire. They were just harassing her for the heck of it. These stories were confirmed by left-wing sources. And I think Daily Wire's article actually mentions that in that particular article. I read a couple different articles on that same story, so I'm not sure if I'm specifically remembering the one from Daily Wire. And then the second one is actually, ironically, that's going to be our Daily Dose of Stupid for today, because I posted it yesterday afternoon. So it's about a whiteness forum talking about how VeggieTales are racist. So neither of these stories are doing anything other than reporting the raw facts. Because there's some opinion pieces that the Daily Wire puts out that I can, even though I wouldn't agree with it, and I don't think that the censorship would be appropriate even then, I can at least see that Facebook would be more apt to censor an opinion piece. These aren't opinion pieces. They're just telling you the story. This is not like Ben Shapiro giving his commentary on what he thinks about these things. He's just telling you the raw facts of the story. And I don't think that Ben Shapiro actually wrote, personally, either one of those 2 articles. I'd have to look that up. But either way, the point is, Facebook is going out of its way to censor yet again. And that first story we covered yesterday about Alexandria Ocasio-Cortez getting her facts wrong, that's not just a right-wing opinion. There were people on the left that were saying the same thing. And the second one is about the left attacking VeggieTales, so I don't really get why they were censoring that one or how that doesn't meet the community standards. But either way, a friend had one that was censored about one woman that wanted to have both families and careers, and this was a Daily Wire article as well. One of them that sent me a screen grab and posted it. So there was an article on Daily Wire about women that want to have careers and families. I don't know what the article actually contained because I didn't look at it, but that one was also censored. Probably for the same reason. Probably just, something stupid. But the claim is that it violates the community standards, but here's what bothers me. And you just saw the post on the screen yourself. They tell you that it violates the community standards, but they don't tell you how, and they don't tell you which community standard you're violating. And so that would be like a police officer pulling you over and saying, I'm writing you a ticket. And you say, well, was I speeding? I'm not going to tell you. Did I run a red light? Oh, I'm not going to tell you. Well, how am I supposed to correct my behavior if you're not telling me what violation I just committed? That's one of the big issues that I have with Facebook. They have this large, broad, sweeping ideas about community standards, and they make them so broad and so vague that basically you could qualify any post, regardless of what it was, under a violation of those standards, just kind of based on their whims. It's not a very clear, concise way to explain to people, these are things you must not do. And that's the hallmark of any good rule, that it's very clear to everybody that is being explained to, this is how to be in compliance with the rule, this is how to violate the rule. And so they don't only not tell you the way that the rule was violated, they don't even tell you which rule was violated. So you have no way to correct your own behavior. And this is part of the problem that I have with Facebook censorship as a whole. Now, granted, Facebook is a private company. They can kick you off Facebook just because they don't like who you are. They can kick you off because they don't like your haircut. If Facebook wanted to today say, you know what, we really don't like conservatives, so you conservatives, you're all gone. Colquitt, you're gone. Ben Shapiro, you're gone. Glenn Beck, you're gone. Steven Crowder, you're gone. We don't like conservatives. We don't like that you're using our medium to spread your message because we're liberals, and so you're out. They're a private company. They can do that if they want to. But what really bothers me is that Facebook is pretending to be objective, pretending to be just an uninterested third party that just acts as a vantage point or a forum for everybody of all opinions. And then they say that, and yet it seems as though it's only conservative voices that actually get censored. And that's what bothers me about it. In fact, why don't we go to a clip? This is Senator Ted Cruz on the Senate floor talking with Mark Zuckerberg. And you'll see that this is unfortunately kind of par for the course when it comes to Facebook and their censorship, and Ted Cruz kind of points that out.
Stories from trending news, including stories about CPAC, including stories about Mitt Romney, including stories about the Lois Lerner IRS scandal, including stories about Glenn Beck. In addition to that, Facebook has initially shut down the Chick-fil-A Appreciation Day page, has blocked a post of a Fox News reporter, has blocked over 24 Catholic pages, and most recently blocked Trump supporters Diamond and Silk's page with 1.2 million Facebook followers after determining their content and brand were, quote, unsafe to the community. To a great many Americans, that appears to be a pervasive pattern of political bias. Do you agree with that assessment?
Senator, let me say a few things about this. First, I understand where that concern is coming from because Facebook and the tech industry are located in Silicon Valley, which is an extremely left-leaning place. And this is actually a concern that I have and that I try to root out in the company, is making sure that we don't have any bias in the work that we do. And I think it is a fair concern that that people would at least wonder about.
Let me ask this question. Are you aware of any ad or page that has been taken down from Planned Parenthood?
Senator, I'm not, but let me just...
How about MoveOn.org?
Sorry?
How about MoveOn.org?
I'm not specifically aware of those.
How about
cases.
any Democratic candidate for office?
I'm not specifically aware. I mean, I'm not sure.
And see, that's the problem that a lot of us have with that, and Ted Cruz just does a great job of illustrating that in this particular hearing with Facebook CEO and founder Mark Zuckerberg. It just seems as though the only thing that ever actually gets centered are conservative viewpoints. I don't remember a news story about Planned Parenthood getting censored, or MoveOn.org, or Think Progress, or the DNC. That just doesn't seem to happen. But we also had candidates, for example, running for office. In California, a woman that was running for the House that was talking about her experience and her father and mother's experience under Pol Pot and some of the horrific things that her parents endured, and they censored her speech when she was running a pretty good race against a Democrat in California. And so it just seems as though somehow this never happens to liberals. It never happens to liberal viewpoints and people that hold those beliefs. And so you're telling us that there is no bias, and yet when these incidents happens, it only seems to happen to conservatives. And that's really the issue that you're running into. I remember that there was one company that I remember doing a story a few months ago. There was one company that just raised Cain at Facebook that was a left-leaning company, and I believe it was Think Progress. But even in that case, they didn't censor the story. They just included that there was a more conservative-leaning outlet that I believe it was it National Review? I believe it was National Review that fact-checked that particular story, and they put it accompanying it to there. They didn't censor the speech. They just said, oh, and by the way, here's another article that addresses this that you may be interested that does a fact check, which frankly, I don't agree with either. I don't necessarily like that Facebook did that, but even in that case that the left got upset about, they still didn't censor them. They still didn't shut them out. They still didn't stop people from sharing that particular article. This is a very clear case of them doing exactly that. And so it just seems a little odd that you'll say, well, there is no bias, and yet somehow it's only conservative voices that this ever happens to. Now, I don't know if it's intentional or not. I don't know if people are actually going out and trying to find conservative viewpoints and shut those down specifically, but here's the problem that you're running into. They'll say that it's the algorithm that does that, and that may be true. But the thing about an algorithm, the thing about a computer program that you are the one that puts in the qualifications, is it's garbage in, garbage out. In other words, if you're somebody that has left-leaning sensibilities and you believe that, for example, misgendering somebody like we just saw with Twitter a couple weeks ago, that all of a sudden you're saying that misgendering now is something that is wrong, well, then you're pretty much only going to be censoring conservative voices when that comes to fruition. You're not going to be censoring a whole lot of people on the left when that takes place. If you're saying that, for example, we've seen on college campuses, and I'm not trying to attribute this to Facebook, but we've seen on college campuses that there are a lot of guidelines that they will put forward saying that you can't say this, 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 and this because it's offensive to these groups. Well, conservatives really aren't so much into the whole censoring free speech thing, and so by default, if you are censoring those things, you're really only going to be censoring people that have a conservative viewpoint. And so even if it actually is the algorithm, and it may just be the algorithm, if the people programming that algorithm and explaining to the computer what is offensive are people that are on the left, then of course the computer is going to act as if it is somebody on the left that has those sensibilities that are censoring out these viewpoints. And so that's the problem that you're running into. Computers are annoying for exactly the same reason that they're useful. They only do what you tell them to do. And that's the problem that you're running into, and the reason that this censorship is taking place. And that's an issue because the left seems to have a real problem with opposing viewpoints. And I think the reason for that is because the second a lot of their philosophies, not all of them, but a lot of their ideas start getting scrutinized, when you actually put them to the test, they can't survive rational thought for very long. I mean, if you're talking about, for example, Medicare for all, the statistics are woefully against the liberals when it comes to that talking point. When you're talking about, for example, the one that we were just talking about before with mass shootings with guns, the facts are way against them when it comes to that. And because of that, they know that any opposing viewpoints are going to completely destroy their argument to any rational thinking person, and that's why you have to shut down the other person, because that's the only way to win the argument. In fact, that is a testament to how weak some of their arguments on those particular issues are. They know they can't stand up to scrutiny, and that's why they try to drown out opposition and opposing viewpoints. See, I'm the opposite. I tell people all the time, if you have an opposing viewpoint, let me know. Help me correct myself. Because here's the thing, I have enough faith in my own positions and my own beliefs to believe that they can withstand scrutiny, to believe that they can withstand somebody calling me up and telling me, no, you're wrong. Because I believe I have the facts on my side, and I believe that it actually can stand up to that kind of criticism. The left and a lot of their ideas simply don't have that. They don't have that ability. And because of that, they want to silence opposing voices. And the left has, in recent weeks, been pressuring Twitter and Facebook and other social media and big tech companies to do more to crack down on what they deem as fake news. And usually what they mean by fake news is news that disagrees with me. Unfortunately, there's some people on the right that also mean news that disagrees with me when they say fake news. But nonetheless, the left has been really trying to pressure Facebook and other companies to crack down on it. We saw this with Alex Jones. And goodness knows I don't like Alex Jones. But this is exactly what I predicted would happen. That if we don't stand up and say it's not right to censor people when it came to Alex Jones, who most people don't like, myself included, then eventually what they're going to do is they're going to come for somebody we do like Ben Shapiro. Unfortunately, it seems that has come to fruition. And that is why we have to take a stand. Even if you don't necessarily like Ben Shapiro all that much, you can stand with freedom of speech. You can stand with being against censorship. We'll go ahead and jump straight to the daily dose of stupid.
That was stupid.
I know it was stupid.
Really stupid.
Hey, I just said it was stupid.
Today's daily dose of stupid, we've actually already hinted at it a little bit because it was one of the stories that got censored the other day on Facebook. VeggieTales apparently is teaching racism. Now, this is something that I find very important because I didn't know that when I was watching VeggieTales that I was actually being taught racism, which is a big problem, because if you've got little kids learning racism, that's an issue. So what happened the other day is there was this whiteness forum at Cal State San Marcos, which, by the way, the whole idea of a whiteness forum seems pretty racist to me. I mean, for example, let's do the old flip over and see if that would play out well if it were the other way around. Can you imagine if a predominantly white school had a blackness forum, and it was a bunch of white people getting together to talk about black people? Heck, if it was a bunch of black people getting together to talk about black people, that to me would seem pretty racist too. So it's hilarious to me that they're getting together to talk about race, despite the fact of the very name of their event seeming pretty racist. But anyway, there's this 2-hour event on campus that they did, which took digs at things like the NFL and white women for perpetuating the patriarchy and all this other crazy stuff. And then at one point, they went after VeggieTales for furthering racism, according to them. Now, I know what you're thinking here, but Caleb, all the characters in VeggieTales are vegetables. They're like green and red and blue and all kinds of other crazy colors. They don't have a race. They're vegetables. Well, see, the problem with that is you are using logic and reason. And you're thinking like a logical, reasonable person that has rational thought. And you cannot understand leftist thinking doing that. And so what you have to do is you have to dive into their mode of thinking, which is let's just be offended at everything and look for things to be offended by constantly. So once you understand that, it makes a lot more sense. And to prove my point, here's some of the quotes from the event. Quote, "The Christian cartoon VeggieTales is racist because all of the villains are vegetables of color." Well, like I said, they're all vegetables of color. They're green and red and blue and all those other things. They continue on. When kids see the good white characters, there are no white characters in VeggieTales. When kids see the good white character triumph over the bad person of color character, they are taught that white is right and minorities are the source of evil. Wow, they've busted this thing wide open. VeggieTales has been on a conspiracy this whole time to subtly give kids racist messages. Man, I don't know what they were smoking at the Whiteness Forum, but it has got to be some good stuff if this is the conclusion that they reached. A student that worked on the forum said this via the College Fix, who originally reported the story. The villains in VeggieTales have ethnic accents such as Latino, while the heroic characters sound white. Okay, so it's not the actual skin tone, it's the voices, which I kind of doubt that kids are going to be able to pick up on that, especially young kids. They're not going to know the difference a lot of times. But B, I don't know if that's necessarily true. Because let's look back at this, and again, you have to go with what's most probable, not necessarily what you feel in the moment. Do you know why Big Idea Productions, which produces VeggieTales, has a lot of characters with different ethnic accents? Because they're low budget. Because if you are a company, and I say this as somebody who has done work as a voice actor, this is my job, this is my profession. If you want to have one voice actor for several different characters, they have to make their voice sound different. And so to do that, one of the easiest ways to accomplish that is to do a different ethnic accent. So for example, if I'm working two different characters and I have to make their voices sound different, one of the easiest ways for me to do that is to do one in my regular voice, my American accent, and do another one, for example, that is Russian. If I want to do a Russian voice, that would be the way I differentiate my characters. That would be how you do it. And so because Big Idea doesn't exactly have a huge staff and a lot of production money, they use the same voice actors for a lot of these characters. And that means that a lot of them are going to be using accents to differentiate their characters. And so, that being said, even if you take that into consideration, though, let's look through a list of VeggieTales titles and see if this alleged racism is actually taking place. Now, granted, I'm only going through the earliest years of VeggieTales just because those are the ones that I was a kid for, thus those are the ones that I remember watching as a child. So let's go through this. Where's God when I'm scared? Okay, in that one, there is one villain that is from Toledo, Ohio. He actually says that he's from Toledo. And he has a very Ohio-sounding accent, which is not an accent at all. That's what it means to be from Ohio. You basically don't get an accent. So a very American-sounding person. The second villain in that one, it would be the wise men in the story of Daniel, who, by the way, have British accents. So an ethnic accent for sure, but British people are white, so not necessarily one that would be subtly teaching kids racism. God wants me to forgive them. Well, the villains in that one is actually a Southern family, so all the bad guys have Southern accents. I don't think that means that VeggieTales subtly hates Southerners, that they're teaching kids to hate people from the South. Just so happens that the villains in that particular story have Southern accents. Are You My Neighbor? There's not really a bad guy in that one. I don't really think that there's a villain in that particular one. Rack Shack and Benny. Okay, in that one, the bad guy is King Nebuchadnezzar, and he has an American-sounding accent too. Dave and the Giant Pickle. Well, the Giant Pickle named Goliath, because it's the story of David, would be the bad guy, and to my knowledge, the pickle never speaks. I don't think he has a single line in that whole movie. The Toy That Saved Christmas, never saw that one. Larry Boy and the Fib from Outer Space. Okay, in that one, the bad guy is the Fib from Outer Space, and he has sort of a Southern Bronx accent, so he sounds like he's from New York City. Josh and the Big Wall. In this particular one, the bad guys are the French peas sitting on top of the walls of Jericho that are pouring down, again, this is how ridiculous and silly this is, milkshakes on the children of Israel. I mean, it's a children's cartoon. That's how the whole thing works. Madame Blueberry. The bad guys in that one would have British accents because it's the Scallions again. Larry Boy and the Rumor Weed. Well, in this particular one, again, the Rumor Weed has an American-sounding accent. King George and the Ducky. Okay, in that one, the bad guy is actually King George, who represents King David, and that would be Larry the Cucumber, which again has an American accent. Esther, the girl who became queen. In that one, the bad guy is Mr. Lunt. I don't really know what his accent is. It's certainly not ethnic, though, because he's playing Haman in the story of Esther. I don't know what you would call his accent, but it's definitely not foreign. Lyle the Kindly Viking. In that one, again, just a regular American-sounding guy. Sumo of the Opera. Well, the bad guy in that one has a deep voice, but it's certainly not an ethnic accent. Lord of the Beans. In that one, again, the bad guy has a British accent. And then Larry Boy and the Bad Apple. The bad guy in that one actually has it's sort of a cabaret singer kind of style. So when we're looking through that list, that apparently all the villains are vegetables of color, whatever the heck that means, because their voices sound ethnic and all the heroes sound white. We just looked through that list of about 16 movies, and it looks like there were 4 accents out of all the villains, 3 of them British, 1 of them French. Both countries that are predominantly white. So I have no idea where they're getting this. But that is their claim, and apparently they're sticking with it, although there's no truth to it whatsoever. So the real question becomes, why do people think this? Why do people assume that there's something evil or nefarious going on here? Look, if white people like it, there is a certain contingency of the left. I'm not saying all of them, but there is a plurality of people on the left that assume that if a lot of white people like something, it must be racist somehow. And there is mostly the same contingency on the left that believes that if it's Christian or it teaches traditional family values, it's somehow furthering the patriarchy, and thus it must be somehow racist in there somewhere. And so there is an assumption of racism for anything that's even remotely connected to Christianity, morality, or Western civilization as a whole. Anything that teaches traditional morals, they are going to assume is racist somehow. And that's the problem that they're running into. Now, among some liberals, there's sort of this self-loathing when it comes to white people. So there's a lot of white liberals that have this sort of guilt, and I don't really understand why, but they do. And because of that, they kind of hate anything that is associated with white people, which VeggieTales isn't even necessarily doing. I actually know quite a few black kids that went to church, either at my congregation or at other congregations, that love VeggieTales. It's a completely harmless thing that they've tried to twist into something evil. But there are certain people that unfortunately just look for racism in everything. And if you don't believe me, Barack Obama just a couple of weeks ago was saying the reason that we're not buying more solar panels is because of racism. Now, what was his justification for that? Well, he didn't give one because there is no logic there. But literally, that's what he was saying. He's saying the reason we haven't embraced green energy and we haven't gone to a completely green system is because people are racist. It makes no sense. But I mean, that is proof positive. Both that and the VeggieTales story, that there are some people on the left that they just look for racism in absolutely everything. And racism is the reason for every problem or bad thing that has ever happened to them. The thing about that is when you look for something, you tend to find it. And these people are looking for people to be hateful to them and to be racist against them. And because of that, they find it, even when it's not actually there. And for that, I really do feel sorry for them. It's a really crummy way to look at the world and to look at the human race, to look at other people. I genuinely feel sorry for them because of that. All right, so we're going to go ahead and go to the chaplain's report, hopefully something a little bit more uplifting.
In 1775, the Continental Congress created the Chaplain Corps. Under the command of General George Washington, each soldier was required to attend worship service every Sunday. While other armies advanced on their feet, Washington's troops advanced on their knees. It's time for the Chaplain's Report with Caleb Colquitt on tactics.
All right, we're continuing our little mini-series here on the Book of Ruth. And one thing that's important for you to understand in the context of this verse is, since we last left them in the last verse that we looked at, Boaz has not only invited Ruth to glean in his fields, which he's left this behind for the poor, for the less fortunate, to be able to partake of that and have something to eat themselves. Boaz has not only invited her to do that and asked her to take and participate in that, but he says, don't go to any other field, and in fact, you can take of the water, you can stay with the maids, and then we also see a little short episode later, I'm guessing it was some kind of lunch that was going on during the workday, that she's actually seated with Boaz's maidservants, and she is partaking of bread that they have cooked. So they're not only allowing her to take some stuff home, they're actually feeding her while she's there gleaning as well. So Boaz taking very good care of her while she is in his presence, despite the fact that she really has no ability to do anything for him in return. And so he lets her eat with his maidservants, and then he lets her continue to glean and tells his servants to treat her well. And then she gathers up the sheaves of wheat and then goes on her way. So what happens after this? Well, we can go to Ruth chapter 2, verses 17 and 18. So she gleaned in the field until evening. Then she beat out what she had gleaned, and it was about an ephah of barley. And she took it up and went to the city, and her mother-in-law saw that she had gleaned. She also took it out and gave Naomi what she had left after she was satisfied. So there's a couple things we need to notice about this particular little episode in Ruth. First of all, Ruth is taking care of Naomi and leaving comfort to do so. So she's there, seated with the maidservants, working the fields, gleaning, and Boaz is kind enough to invite her. Now, we don't know if this group broke up, but it seems to me, just based on my understanding of the scripture, is that she could have stayed there and actually been, enjoy the food and everything, but at some point she broke off from doing so and being fed with cooked bread to go off and glean herself, even though she was satisfied, because she knows that Ruth hasn't had that same advantage. Naomi hasn't had that same advantage. She hasn't had a meal with her like she just had. And so even though now Ruth's belly is full, she leaves that comfort to go and take care of Naomi, which again demonstrates her loyalty to her mother-in-law. And she goes out and she breaks up the wheat herself and makes something with it and takes it to Naomi. And Naomi is able to partake of the barley that Ruth has gathered, and she's able to partake of it. Now she's satisfied as well. So Ruth, because she's the selfless person that she is, she leaves that comfort in order to make sure that Naomi's needs are taken care of. And that's important because we as Christians need to be able and to be willing to do that as well. Because we need to, if we know that there is a brother or a sister, or even just a stranger, that is in need of our assistance, that is depending on us, then it is important that we realize that their needs are more important than ours. And that's what love actually means. Because at that point, Ruth was satisfied. She could probably have been fine, just not continuing to glean and not going back to Naomi. But you know what? That wasn't who she was. She's already left her own country and left her own family in order to take care of Naomi. And now she's doing exactly that. She is leaving her own comfort behind and worrying about what Naomi needs and what Naomi wants. That's the kind of Christian spirit that we need to have towards other people as well. And I want you to also notice something that's just sort of a minor note, but I think it's significant. Notice that even though gleaning was charity and it was something that was not required of the children of Israel to do, that there was still work involved. So, yes, the fields were left out of the goodness and charity of a person's heart in order to allow people that were less fortunate to be able to partake of that as well. But you'll notice also that that didn't mean that they didn't have to work for it. The person that was going to glean, they still had to go there. They still had to take out the sheath, because it wasn't harvested grain. It was grain that they themselves had to gather up and harvest. And then they're the ones that were responsible for cooking and preparing it. And so, while it was charity in a sense, it also really wasn't a handout. There was still work involved even when you were getting something for free. And so, really, I do think that this speaks volumes to the kind of attitude that God wants us to have, because this was a part of His law. This was a part of the law of Moses. So while we still are willing to help people out that need it and to leave things behind and allow them an opportunity to flourish and to take care of their needs, we also need to recognize that there is an expectation of work even in God's law. And so that was an important part of the gleaning laws that were put forward by Moses. And it's important to note, too, that in this, God always has a way to provide. You'll notice that He blessed Ruth through Boaz. He blessed Ruth by having his servant Boaz, who was obeying his will and doing what God commanded him to do. And because of that, he was able to be a blessing to Ruth. And because Ruth was a virtuous person who went out and gathered and had this blessing from Boaz, she was then in turn able to go out and bless Naomi by giving her the fruit of her labor and giving her what she had gleaned from Boaz. And this is really the way that it's supposed to work. And this is the reason that we are a community of believers, that we're supposed to be a church. We're supposed to be the body of Christ. Because sometimes God, I would actually even say most of the time, God blesses people through His servants. God will occasionally give us things and provide for us and make sure that we're taken care of, but usually He does that through the work of His servants, through the work of His kingdom. And that is something that is powerful to remember, that God can work through us and allow us to be a blessing to others. And when that happens, when we're able to help another person like that, we should count that as joy, because we are being used by our Heavenly Father to be a blessing and to provide for somebody else. We shouldn't look at that as an obligation or a grudgery, something that we have to mumble about. That should be something that we look at and we think, wow, look at this amazing thing that God is doing for this person through me. And that will also help keep us humble and help us to remember that it's not really us doing it, or that it's not a credit to us, that we are able to bless other people because we have been greatly blessed by God. I think that here the idea applies where Jesus said, freely you have been given, so freely give. Stay the course, friends.